Hey guys, this is Eric Weingartner with Weingartner Racing. Today's video is about the dyno test results from these three intake manifolds. And I'm going to show you all the dyno numbers and tell you about what happened with it and everything that goes with it in this video. Before I do that, I want to tell you most of these results are going to be available in a book that I've collated. So this is one of the first versions. And you can go to my website at wengines.com and you'll see a link to my online store where you can purchase these books, because several of you said, I can't see the graphs and charts on the video. Well, buy the book. The book will have all that in there and you can peruse it easily. It's much easier than trying to see it on your phone, pausing a video and trying to expand it to make sure you can see the numbers. Even though I will say them out loud, you get the idea. If you're much more of a visual person to have it in your hands, it's the way to go. The book's gonna run $40. It's pre-order right now. So all those results you see today and from last week's videos and the coming weeks, and even the flow numbers and all that, it's gonna be in the book. However, you can purchase other books from the other dyno tests that are on that website as well, my online store, so you can see them as well. So I know it sounds like I'm trying to give a plug, but the money made from the books just goes back into more dyno testing. So if there's something cool you want to see that I'm not doing, I don't have an unlimited budget. Most of this is probably, I'd say, I do 70% comes from me, the other 30% comes from whatever the book sales are. And if I don't meet that total, well, it's just going to wait. So if you like to see a test happen sooner rather than later, well, you get the idea. Anyway, let's get to it. So here are the three manifolds, and this one looks goofy, and I'll tell you why in a minute. The manifold this is the Edelbrock Victor Jr. It's a 2975. Now it's an older version, but it has been port matched to a 1206. I didn't do it. An actual viewer sent this in. He didn't think it was going to be that great. I said, you know what, we'll try it. Well, I tried it back when we had the other heads on the engine. It was the best one then, and tried it on now, and it's the best 4150 so far. We only tested 5 intakes so far on this head combination. This is an Edelbrock. Let me get this out of the way. This is an Edelbrock Super Victor, but it's the 2970. Essentially, this is the Super Victor version for a Dominator. It's completely stock. Nothing's been modified whatsoever. Then there's this one. This is the Hulk 23. It's a Dominator top as well. This comes from Chris Ratco. This is completely stock as well. And I want to point out this intake is not at all designed for what this engine that I dyno tested on was. It's more of a fun test, let's see what happens type of thing. So don't think that this intake is a turd or anything. This is not at all what that intake was designed to go on. But it was interesting to get to test it and see. As far as design looks, it looks the best, but it is not designed for this combination. This intake is really designed for a much more higher RPM combination. So now let's talk about the combination. If you haven't watched any of my previous videos, I highly recommend you go back and watch them so you can hear more about the dyno test with this dyno mule. The dyno mule is a 406 small block Chevy. It's got a scat rotating assembly, Race Tech pistons, or flat top. I think we're 11.3 compression ratio. The tests were done with pump gas with a splash of 110 only for safety, although it never needs it. The timing was set at 36 degrees. It's got a solid roller cam that came from Urson. It's a 260, 270, and a 685 lift, 108 lobe separation. If you didn't pay attention to that part, go back and rewind, because in the last video, I even showed the cam specs, and I had no more than 5 people comment, what are the cam specs, and was said in the first minute of the video. So that's it. The heads were Pro Max Project X 215 heads. They're completely stock. They're an as-cast head. You know, of all the heads I've flowed, it's the highest flowing as-cast head I've ever flowed, period. For a small block Chevy. Those were used. Other than that, it's got a 1000 CFM Demon carburetor, 4150 style, that was used when we tested with the 4150. And when we tested with the Dominator, it was the Holley Sportsman 1050 Dominator carburetor, brand new as well. That's pretty much essentially it. The tests were done at Dunsworth Machine Shop in Enid, Oklahoma. And we'll be doing more dyno tests there as time progresses. So anyway, the Victor Jr., the way it was tested, in case you're wondering, was this way. The carburetor always had this spacer on it. So if it had a 4150, we always use this spacer. This spacer comes from AFR. It's a 4-hole taper. and of the testing I've done, this has been the best 4-hole taper, and it's actually really one of the cheapest ones too. So because it did so well, that's always gotten tested. So the 4150 was always tested with this spacer itself. Now, the reason why we have these sitting here on the Super Victor was one of the things I wanted to find out was, does a Dominator actually make more power, the carburetor, than a 4150? So the Dominator, yes, it was 1050 CFM, and my Demon, which was 1000 CFM, is 50 CFM less. However, when you look at the dyno graphs, it's only asking for like 700 CFM. And several people have said, well, do you think it would have made more power if you had put a 750 on there? Absolutely not. Even though it might only ask, like it might only be pulling 600 and something CFM, you put a 750 carburetor made less because it takes more energy still, or pumping losses, to pull the air out of a smaller carburetor. The bigger carbs make more power. Now, one of the things people will be getting ready to comment, and are probably typing right now, well, on the track though, they're less responsive. Probably, but not always the case. There's always a point where it's gonna make more power the larger CFM, but at a certain point, it may make more power, but will not run faster on the track. I have tested, even on my small block, my little 355, that 1000 CFM still outran a 750, even though the airflow demand from the engine and when it's pulling in was nowhere near. So, anyway, back to this. I wanted to see if the Dominator would make more power, even though the 50 CFM might give it a little bit more boost. But the biggest thing with the Dominator, and if you've ever had one, you'll know, is because the bores are spread out. So if you look at a 4150, we got our throttle bores are really kind of tight. And on a Dominator, they're much more spread out. So they're more centered over where our ports would be. So does that actually make more power? So in order for us to test this, I took this Dominator intake, and my carburetor has the dual bolt pattern, so it would bolt on it. And HVH makes this amazing adapter that's a 4-hole taper that's made for this. And I had one, and I loaned it to someone and never got it back. The spacer itself's like 250 bucks, so it's super expensive. So what I did when we were on the dyno, we're like, we'll just try this. And this is exactly kind of how it would run. We took a 2-inch, and this is an adapter, a 4150 to a 4500 adapter, bolted it on, then also put on this spacer like that to test the 4150 carburetor, because we'd use this spacer for all the others. You couldn't, even though the bolt pattern would fit, so that's one thing people are gonna say, why don't you just, it's got a dual bolt pattern, why don't you just bolt it on? The carburetor will bolt on, but the linkage, which is where it opens and closes, will actually hit right here. So if I was to grind into the intake, I could probably get it to fit. However, even with the wood spacer, I got it to clear there, but the carburetor was too far inside the spacer and it had a huge vacuum leak. So this is the only way we get it to work at the time constraints. After that was to the Dominator on both of these. So that's why we have the spacers. Let's get to the results. Move my book out of the way. So this very first one is the Victor Jr. And this is like I said, it's great. 4150 carburetor, you look at it, it's making 614 horsepower, 548 foot-pounds of torque. Thing's a beast, right? It's great, fantastic stuff there. Now, this is with that 2-inch, it's that setup on that intake. 4150, it made 586 horsepower, 526 foot-pounds of torque. And if you compare that to the Victor Jr., it sucked. And look, it's only saying it's pulling 683 CFM, by the way. It looks like it's bad. And I think it was more due to the spacers. So that stupid spacer setup probably hurt it. If I get the HVH one, I think it's gonna come up a little bit more. Do I think it's gonna match the Dominator? Absolutely not. But this was with the 4150. This was with the Dominator. Now things start to change. Now I warn you, out of the box, we put the Dominator on and it did pretty good, but it was really fat. So I ended up taking 4 jets out of the rear on each one and 4 out of each of the front jets and 6 out of the rear. This got us this. And that's 621 horsepower and 546 foot-pounds of torque, which if you look at it, it's more horsepower and almost the same torque. So that was a huge, huge difference. And then to better show you this, I mean, the Dominator definitely picked up over the 4150, but I cannot say, I don't wanna, you can't take this as gospel, because I can't say if it wasn't because of all the weird spacers having so much height and everything was just dumb, that had any more power difference, or if it was just the carburetor, the Dominator actually being better. This will probably be tested again later, just with the better spacer, assuming I just don't want to pay $250 for the spacer. But we'll test it again and we'll see what happens. But let me show you the overlay, because that's a better picture for you guys. This is the Victor Jr. That's in red. Sorry, the red is the Dominator one, the Super Victor 2970 with the Dominator Carb, and the black is the Victor Jr. So if we look at this, you can see the actual Super Victor with the Dominator is actually making more torque at the hit. Now this could be just a jump in the dyno, but if you notice, they're pretty much close together until about 61, and then you can see the bigger Dominator Carburetor just start pulling away, and the bigger setup is just better. So it ends up being better, but mostly at the top. Through the rest of it, it's so close that it doesn't make much of a difference. So even if you're looking at these, you're like, man, that intake's really good, because even with the Dominator, this one's matching it almost. It just beats it at the top. Now, it could be this combination. Don't take this as gospel. And several people said, hey, why don't you do this? And maybe I'll do that. Several of you said, why don't you just take your adapter here and run the Dominator on the Victor Jr. and see what happens. I may do that, but I think that's also dumb, because the benefits for the Dominator is that it puts the bores out here instead of that. I don't think that's going to do very well, but we'll test maybe. But anyway, that's the Super Victor. How does the Hulk manifold do? Well, let's take a little look here. Okay, so just to recap, this is that 2970 with the Dominator carburetor. I forgot to mention too that on the Dominator carburetor, we used a 1-inch Hamburg. It was a red one, 4-hole tapered spacer. I just happened to have it. I used it for flow testing and stuff. Unfortunately, I don't have any pictures. I left it at the dyno, but that was what was used, a 1-inch for it. And it's a 4-hole taper, and just what we used. So when we switch to the Hulk manifold, the Hulk 23, let's just take a bit closer look so you can get a better idea on how much of a difference it is before I show the results. This is that 2970. So it's got a clover leaf. Dividers are also actually, the runner links are actually longer. And then you look at the Hulk. The Hulk has way better line of sight, especially on the back one. The runners themselves, and I measured here and here, these are actually about, on top of my memory, about a ½ inch longer, sorry, ½ to ¼ inch longer. I have to go back and look at my notes. But they are definitely longer on this. This one's not. However, the cross-section on these, the Hulk one is far larger than that one. So, now back to the result. With the Hulk manifold, same spacer, same Dominator carburetor. If you look, we now make 604 horsepower, but at 6,900 RPM. If you compare where I made peak before, it was at 67, so move the peak up 200 RPM. It also makes 516 foot-pounds of torque, which is a huge loss of about 30 from the 2970. And before you think, well, that manifold's not very well, again, I want to emphasize it's not at all designed for this. It's really designed for more of a high RPM deal. And this is not. We're only going to 7,000 RPMs. So, however, I really wanted, because Chris Radko's a great guy anyway, and he didn't even know I was doing this test. So I was like, I'm going to try to give this thing the best advantage I can. So we'd been running the 1-inch Hamburg spacer, but I was like, I brought another spacer, and I brought a 2-inch Pro Comp, yes, Pro Comp, Chinesium, 4-hole spacer, because one, it was in stock and it was $45. For the record, it does not fit right away. You have to actually drill out the holes for the studs to actually go through, because it won't fit. And then I deburred everything, but I was like, you know what? Maybe it will make some difference. Maybe I want to see what it does. Maybe it's going to be better. So let's just try a different spacer. So I did that, and here's what happens. So when that spacer went on, it went up to 606 or 7 horsepower, and now at 6,800 RPM. And look, it went 523 horse torque, so which was a gain. Now here's this. I've never had a spacer make this much of a difference, but it did. And this isn't and I'm not trying to promote Pro Comp at all. I was like, I know it's cheap. I'm just going to try it. It probably isn't going to work anyway. Let's give it a shot. Let me pull out this. This overlay is going to make a huge difference. This is just the difference in spacers. So the red one is the Pro Comp 2-inch versus the 1-inch Hamburg is in black. Yeah, it's a huge difference. Now at the top, not so much, but look throughout the range. I mean, that's pretty big, especially for just a spacer. Usually a spacer will make like they'll track and maybe they'll have a little spots where they're slightly ahead. Not like this. Now granted, it's 1 inch bigger, but yeah, that was kind of unusual. So then I thought, you know what, I've got another spacer. And I had this one. Now this is a carburetor isolator spacer. This is 1 inch. And it doesn't look anything fancy from this, but let me explain the premise for it. This rubber goes all the way through. You don't use a gasket. This is the gasket, so it kind of sticks up. This seals the carburetor, but it also attaches to the bottom here, and it seals to that. Now look, that's an anti-reversion plate. It's got a little cone coming out. These are anti-reversion steps to help with the anti-reversion pulse. And what I mean by carburetor isolator, if you look, it's 2 pieces. So what happens is you screw this Allen into the intake, and then you screw this into this top plate, and you bolt your carb to that. The carb literally is floating on this rubber isolator. The idea is that it doesn't vibrate as much, so the fuel doesn't foam as much, so there's less air bubbles in the fuel, and it's supposed to give a more consistent air-fuel ratio, and it's supposed to make more power. Plus, with the anti-reversion step and the 4 cone, it should make more power. And this is what it did. It made 605 and 521 torque. So it actually made more torque than the Hamburg spacer. Let me see if I can pull that one in. Not that one. I already covered it up. Yeah, I'll just get here. I'll just take my time here. The Hamburger spacer made 522, so this one made about the same as the Hamburg spacer. No, sorry, that's the Pro Comp one. It made the same torque as the Pro Comp spacer, so more than the Hamburger spacer, and about the same horsepower as the Hamburger spacer. So not as good as the Pro Comp one, but close on torque. So that was interesting. So that was a cool test, right? Still, I know some of you are like, wow, the Super Victor beat it. Well, I wasn't done testing. There was something stupid I wanted to try. And you're gonna love this if you stuck around for this. You're gonna get a kick out of this. This intake's huge. If you're watching the video, you think, that's a big intake. You know what? I got tired of people saying, why don't you ever pull these in? Why don't you ever do a low RPM test? You need to do a low RPM. Why are you starting your test at 4,500 RPM? You know, you need to go lower. You know, street cars. Because honestly, this would be fine in a street car, and I've said it before because it's pointless. But I did it anyway. And the reason why I say it's pointless is because if I take this one, you're going to see in a second, we took it way down. If you're at this low RPM and at full-on throttle, your engine's in a boat. In a car, it isn't that way. If you're that low RPM and you floor it, you're out of that RPM range faster than the dyno's accelerating, or you should be. And if you are at that dyno operation and you're like pulling a boat or pulling something itself, you're at a part throttle, not full throttle. So this full throttle, full load test is worthless for you. But I did it. So I took the biggest intake manifold, this one, our biggest Dominator carburetor, you know, our 1050 carburetor, and I said, you know what? Hey, Gary, let's pull it down to 2,500 RPM. So he goes dicking with the dyno because you got to change some stuff on the servo. And they got it to pull down at 2,800 RPM, right? So 2,800, full throttle. Here you go. And how much, before you do that, write in the comments how much torque you think it made. If you watch my other videos, you already know how much it made. How much torque do you think it made at 2,800 RPM when it would roll in? Okay. Here we go. Your dumb dyno test. Ba-boom. This is that, all it didn't change anything. I just had to change the sweep. 2,800 RPM with that Hulk manifold, way too big. Dominator carburetor, 445 foot-pounds of torque rolling in. Now, if you notice, it starts making a dip and it goes down to 410, 406 foot-pounds of torque right here at 3,600 RPM. And then it starts climbing, just like it did before, all the way up to 604. Now, if you notice, it makes a little dip and comes back. The reason for that is because of this long sweep in the dyno, the servo has to make a gigantic movement, so it's really efficient in a certain range, and that's why we make pulls at a lower, closer RPM range. When they're in the farther range like this, it's not as accurate, so it's gonna mess up usually at the end. So, but here's what it looks like as a graph. Ta-da! There you go. That's 2,800 RPM. And you can see this big dip, then it starts jumping up. Yeah. If you never followed Engine Masters, not the show's whatever the show is. The Engine Masters actually was a competition, and we had to make average power from a lower RPM to a higher RPM. This would be the prime example of an engine that would have sucked. If you look at the peaks, 605 and 521 foot-pounds of torque, it doesn't look so bad. In the Engine Masters, and the magazine did a crappy job of trying to even explain this, because so many people got on the magazine and saw our peak numbers, like say here and here, or torque or whatever, and horsepower. They'd be like, 622 horsepower, shoot, I could do that. Because my engine that did the best, the 406, made 622 horsepower, made 571 foot-pounds of torque. However, I don't know how many people thought, I can make 622 horsepower, that's easy. I mean, obviously this did with non-ported heads and everything. The thing we were worried about wasn't here, it was here. This is a killer. We try to make as much torque here at the beginning. So when it rolled in, that, for instance, my 406, it would be like 476 foot-pounds of torque, so it's 25 foot-pounds up. But this is the part that we focused on. So usually to make a small dip, we try to minimize it so it only drop like 10 foot-pounds. So if you were to do that, ours will be almost flat. We're almost 30 foot-pounds or 40 foot-pounds above there. Peak torque wouldn't be maybe 10 more than what, well, it'd be more than this because it's the Dominator one. It's a different one. But it might be 10 foot-pounds of torque more. Peak horsepower, almost identical. We focused here, and that never got explained enough. Causies, if you look at Causies and Bishops, see this dip? That's because of wave tuning and stuff. Causies and Bishops, they would be like almost flat and then come up. They wouldn't even have a dip. So in other words, it'd be like doing this, filling that in. And it cost here and cost a little bit there. Didn't care. That scored better. So there's your little bonus. So did I pull it down low as I can? Sure did. And I hated every minute of it. You want to know why too? When you pull an engine down at 2,500, 2,800 RPM, wide open throttle, it's got locked out timing at 36. It starts trying to rattle too. So I could hear it when it was loading in. I was like, oh, I could hear a little spark knock. And then it came out of it. And there's no reason to pull them that low. Unless you're going to 5,000, there's no need. Anyway, guys, I appreciate you watching this video. Buy a book, helps with the dyno testing. Remember, I'm no Superman. You guys take care.